Shana Tova. This story is told of a young rabbi and an old rabbi who were walking together to shul one Rosh Hashanah morning. So the young rabbi says to her much older colleague, "Rabbi, tell me, here it is, Rosh Hashanah, one of the holiest days of the year. Can you tell me what's on your mind during these holy days?" The old rabbi looks at his much younger colleague and, scratching his long white beard, he says to her, "The hereafter. I have on my mind these days the hereafter." The young rabbi, excited to learn the wisdom of her mentor, says to him, Rabbi, please tell me more about the hereafter." So the rabbi looks at his much younger colleague and smiles. And he says, "You know, at my age, I go from one room to the next and say, wait, what did I come in here after?" The hereafter is on our minds these days as well. So I'll ask you the question, what did you come in here after? We come here after family, the opportunity to be with our family. We come here after friends and our community. We come here after the opportunity to give thanks for all the blessings in our lives, because we are so blessed. In 2019, America, here in Southfield, Michigan, we are blessed. We come here after great music. We come here after deep prayer. And we come here after wisdom. We come here to say thanks. But we also come here, I think, during the season of judgment, on these days of awe, to come here after sanctuary. The historical trends of war, famine, and plague have always brought people to pray as we're confronted with our own mortality and loss of control. War, famine, and plague. It's something very much still on our mind these days, although of course in its contemporary forms. War is in many ways war, though it appears in a much different fashion than it did thousands of years ago. Famine appears in the midst of our anxiety, some a little, some a lot, over the economy, over our jobs, over whether we can send our kids to college, over whether our retirement money will last. And of course, plague expresses itself in the midst of our concerns over the aging of our parents or our own health. That we come here after incredible gratitude for the blessings in our life. Many of us still carry with us those anxieties of war, famine, and plague. So we come here after a sense of sanctuary. And indeed, I'll note this idea of war, famine, and plague, while ancient, takes on new and stronger meaning as the curses, if you will, of the 24/7 news media, as social media continues to reverberate these ideas, these anxieties over and over again. Our fears are multiplied upon themselves. And so fear goes to anger. Have you noticed that? Have you noticed people moving from fear to anger? We live in an angry world. Despite how blessed we are and how powerful we are, we live in an angry world. My fears as we enter 5780 is, as a wise man once said, fear leads to anger. Anger leads to hatred. Hatred leads to suffering. I fear that we're a bit on that path right now. And it's not just war, famine, and plague that are causing us to be afraid and to be angry. I'm noticing a trend that many others have pointed out before me. I'm not the first one. Where the powerful are starting to be afraid of losing their power and are acting out of fear. I'm starting to see the vulnerable in their fear gaining some koyach, gaining some power, and are starting to act on their anger. In our society, on a broader level, among both the powerful and the vulnerable, I'm seeing fear turn to anger, And my fear, of course, is that anger turns to hatred, and hatred leads to suffering. And what about us Jews? What about us Jews here in America? Are we powerful or are we vulnerable? Are we Jews in America today powerful or are we vulnerable? Anti-Semitism is on the rise. Anti-Semitic violence across the board. Arson, vandalism. Then, of course, there's the anti-Semitism coming from the left with BDS and anti-Zionism. Are we today powerful or are we vulnerable? And in our power and in our vulnerability, I'm seeing a growing distance among the Jewish people. By and large, most Israelis view themselves as vulnerable. They vote, they act out of their vulnerability. For the longest time now, many American Jews also perceived Israel as vulnerable. We were united over that idea. But today, there's a growing number of American Jews who see Israel as powerful. And there's a disconnect then when they see Israel as powerful and acting out of power, and others see Israel acting out of vulnerability. So which is it? Is Israel powerful or vulnerable? And what about us American Jews? Are we powerful or are we vulnerable? And what does it mean when we can't even agree on that fact alone? American Jews and Israeli Jews are slowly starting to pull apart. And American Jews are slowly starting to pull apart. Are we powerful or are we vulnerable? I'm reminded of the story of Peter, this great anti-Semite that everybody knew about. He walks into the local watering hole, and there he sees in this big bar a room full of people, and a Jew in the corner with a kippah and tzitzit. Peter, the anti-Semite, walks up to the bartender, and he says, "Bartender, I want to order a round of drinks for everybody in the room except the Jew over there." So sure enough, the drinks go out, and Peter, the anti-Semite, looks over at the Jew, and the Jewish guy's smiling. Now Peter's starting to get angry. "Another round, bartender, another round for everybody but the Jews." Sure enough, another round goes out, and there the Jew is in the corner, still smiling. This repeats itself time and time again. Here, 3, 4, 5 rounds of drinks. Peter orders for everybody but the Jew in the corner. Finally, Peter is incensed at the Jew in the corner. He's still smiling. So Peter goes up to the bartender. He says, "Bartender, I've ordered all these drinks for everyone but the Jewish guy there. He's still smiling. What is he, crazy?" And the bartender says, "No, he's the owner." Are we powerful or are we vulnerable? This summer, thanks to the incredible generosity of the William Davidson Foundation and you, my Shaarey Zedek family, I had the opportunity to begin my fellowship with the Shalom Hartman Institute, which will allow me over the next many years to engage in deep Torah study, as well as many trips to Israel. I had the opportunity to learn with Dr. Micha Goodman, who I'm hoping I'll be able to bring here to Shaarey Zedek soon. And Dr. Goodman says that the central message of the Hebrew Bible, the central message to the Jewish people spoken through the Hebrew Bible, is that we should never become like Egypt, nor should we ever return to Egypt. I'll say it again. The central message of the Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh, is that we should neither become like Egypt, nor should we return to Egypt. Now, we know the story of the Bible very well. We know the central story of the Jewish people. And we know that at the end of the book of Genesis, our people go down to Egypt with only 70 in their family. And as we transition from Genesis to Exodus, it of course says, there in Egypt, the Jewish people became a great, mighty, and populous nation. Now, mind you, we might have been great, mighty, and populous, but we were still in Egypt. And we were still a minority in Egypt, and we were still secluded in our own little section of Egypt. But there we were, pretty comfortable, thanks to the legacy of Joseph and the kindness of the Pharaoh who allowed us in in the midst of a famine. But we know what happens next. There arose a king over Egypt who knew not Joseph. The king of Egypt, the Pharaoh, became afraid of this nation. Even though he was the most powerful man at the time in all the world, and even though the Egyptians were the most powerful in all the world, he became afraid of us Jews. And we know what happens. Fear leads to anger. Anger leads to hatred. Hatred leads to suffering. And so we became oppressed and enslaved for 400 years. And so it is that when we became a powerful nation into and of ourselves, that God and the prophets said to our people, when you have power, you cannot become like Egypt. When you have power, you cannot become like Egypt. And so the Torah commands us not once and not twice, but 36 times to remember that we were strangers in a different land. And the Torah commands us, you shall love the stranger, because you were strangers in the land of Egypt. In the midst of our power, the Torah reminds us, we are forbidden from taking advantage of the vulnerable among us. We cannot, in our fear at losing our power, forget our obligation to care for those who are in need, including and especially the peaceful strangers living amongst us. You shall not become like Egypt, the Hebrew Bible says. But just as we can't become like Egypt, we're not allowed to return to Egypt either. Why, after 400 years of suffering and slavery, did God finally take note of our ancestors to let them out of slavery? We finally cried out to God and said, God, help us. We gave up on trying to appeal to Pharaoh. We gave up on trying to appeal to the power of the land and started instead to appeal to the power above, the one true King of Kings or Queen of Queens, the Almighty. We cannot become like Egypt, but we can't return to Egypt either. We can't put our trust in any human leader. We can't put our trust in political parties. And we certainly shouldn't put our trust in countries, that things will just go fine for the Jews. Because we know what happens. Fear leads to anger. Anger leads to hate. And hate leads to suffering. We cannot return to Egypt. There's another midrash given as to why, after 400 years of slavery, that God finally took note of us to let us free, and not just because it was our faith, but because finally, after all this time, Jews started to help each other out. Jews started to help each other out. When one Israelite would finish his quota of bricks and he'd see another Israelite suffering and trying to reach his quota, he'd go over and he'd help him. And together, they would achieve their quota. And it wasn't until God finally saw the Israelites taking care of each other, it wasn't until our ancestors finally stood strong together, that God took note of them and brought them to the promised land. Our Hebrew Bible reminds us time and again that we cannot become like Egypt, nor can we return to Egypt. My friends, with 5780 upon us now, I enter this new year with some trepidation. Not only do I see the common fears of war, famine, and plague that have existed throughout all time, not only do I see the amplification of those fears through the modern age of war, famine, and plague, but I see the storm clouds of power and vulnerability, and what happens when people have misplaced fear, and that fear becomes anger turns into hatred, and hatred turns to suffering. So it is that we have to remember this central teaching of our Hebrew Bible, that we're obligated not to become like Egypt, and thus to love the strangers among us. And we're obligated never to return to Egypt either, to put our faith in God and God alone, as well as in each other. The great Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik, the Rav of the 20th century, he asks an interesting halachic question. He says, if you come upon a man that has two heads, how many sets of tefillin should he own? I know that if you came upon a man with two heads, that would be your very first question. How many sets of tefillin should he own? So Rav Soloveitchik says, if it's two heads with one body, if it's two different people that happen to share one body, then he should have two sets of tefillin, one for each head. But if it's one body that happens to have two heads, then he's obligated to wear only one set of tefillin. Now it's all clear, right? So Rabbi Soloveitchik comes to teach. And he says, how do you know whether this is two different people who happen to share one body, or whether it's really one body that happens to have two heads? He says, how do you know the answer to that question? It's easy. You take a cup of scalding water and you dump it on top of one of the heads. Not the most PC of explanations, but stick with me for a minute. Rav Soloveitchik teaches that if you pour hot water on one head and both heads cry out, then it's one body that happens to have two heads. If only one head cries out, then it's two different people. Storm clouds are gathering. Anti-Semitism is on the rise. Anti-Semitic violence, anti-Semitic vandalism, arson, BDS, anti-Semitism. There's a growing distance among Jews here in America because we can't agree whether we're powerful or whether we're vulnerable. There's a growing distance across the Atlantic Ocean between some American Jews and Israeli Jews because we can't agree whether we are powerful or whether we're vulnerable. So we are, as Jews do, fighting. We're arguing with each other. But as Rav Soloveitchik comes to teach us, if you were to pour, God forbid, boiling water on one head of the Jewish people, the other head must cry out too. The other head will cry out too, because we're one people. If a Jew is suffering in Israel, Jews around the world will stand up for him or her. Just as if a Jew is suffering here in America, whether we agree with them, whether we disagree with them, whether they're liberal or whether they're conservative, whether they're Democrats or whether they're Republicans, we have to stand up for each other. We have to find a way to support each other, to stay strong as one people, because the storm clouds are gathering. My friends, as 5780 begins, I'm filled with some sense of trepidation, some fear. Because I see the fear that's around us, I see the anger that's around us. And I know that fear can lead to anger, anger can lead to hate, and hate can lead to suffering. But if we make a commitment here and now that as Jews, we'll never forget that we were strangers once. And as a result, we have to love the stranger and care for the strangers among us. We cannot become like Egypt. Similarly, let us remember the teaching of our Hebrew Bible, that just as we cannot become like Egypt, we must not return to Egypt either. Let us be strong in our faith, and perhaps just as much, if not more so, let us make a commitment here and now that whether we agree with each other or whether we disagree with each other, as American Jews or as American Jews and Israeli Jews, we'll stand together as one people. As the shofar blasts, may it stir us to a reminder to love the strangers among us, that we should not become like Egypt. As the shofar blasts, let it remind us to be strengthened in our faith and to trust only God and not some earthly leader. And when the shofar blasts, let us remember that as to each other we must turn when the storm clouds gather, and that we must and always be there for each other as Jews, as one people. Ken Yehi Ratzon, may this be God's will, and let us say together, Amen.